Greetings. I'm speaking to you shortly before we enter the season of the autumn festivals. Americans would prefer the alliteration fall festivals. This time of year, Americans and Canadians are probably thinking about football. There was a fellow who was talking about his last experience playing tackle football. He said, "I broke a collarbone and 3 ribs. Fortunately, none of them were mine." Hope you get a kick out of that. As I said, those of us who are concerned with the appointed times, God's appointed times, are looking forward now to observing several of them coming up in the 7th month on the sacred calendar preserved by the Jewish community, as they have preserved the Old Testament. And today I want to talk about appointed times of autumn. Appointed times of autumn. Each of the festivals, appointed times, has a threefold significance, I would say at least. A threefold significance. There's a historic significance, there's a theological significance, and there's a prophetic significance. So I want to go into the coming four festivals coming up and discuss those festivals from that perspective. And first of all, let me say that if you were to see me, you might know I'm coming if you see my shadow. And you might remember that I'm leaving if you see my shadow as I'm leaving. You know, the shadow is naturally there. You know, if the conditions are right, then of course the shadow is there. And it accompanies me. It reminds me of the Disney movie Peter Pan, where, Peter Pan comes looking for his shadow, and he has to have his, a shadow sewn back on, connected to him. So these festival days, these appointed times are shadows, and the central character in these festivals is Jesus Christ. He is the hero of the holy days. The holy days remind us of God's plan of salvation. So we want to observe them. We want to observe them in a right spirit, a spirit of respect for one another. We may have differences in how we observe these days, but we want to respect. The main thing is we do it. In Colossians 2, we're told, Colossae was a place where people valued asceticism, and the way we keep the festival days might not sit too well in that place. They might not think we're very spiritual if we really enjoy the festival. But you remember what they were told in Nehemiah 8. Eat the fat, drink the sweet, and give to those who need, and so on. Have a joyous time. And so the Apostle Paul tells the Colossians, let no one judge you in food or in drink, or regarding a festival or new moon or Sabbaths, which are a shadow of things to come, but the substance is of Christ. So let's remember, as we keep these days, to focus on the meaning of these days, God's plan of salvation, and the central figure, Jesus Christ. As I said, he is the hero of the holy days. But these are God's appointed times. He gave them initially to the children of Israel, but they're not going to stay there. They're going to spread worldwide, as Zechariah 14 shows us. It talks about nations coming to keep the Festival of Tabernacles, if you remember the passage there. And in Leviticus 23, God says, through the pen of Moses, these, what do we call it? What do we call that when you're using a feather? The quill. I guess maybe the quill, or whatever he used. And the Eternal spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, the feast of the Eternal." Now these are Moadim, appointed times. And back in Genesis, verse 14, we have the astronomical features so that we can have these appointed times. Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, the feasts of the eternal, which you shall proclaim to be holy convocations. So these are times to come together. Holy convocations, these are my feasts, my appointed times. And at the end of the passage, verse 44, at the end of the chapter, so Moses declared to the children of Israel the feasts of the eternal. And I want to go to Leviticus 23. Well, I'm here already. And I want to go to verse 23. Then the Eternal spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, saying, the 7th month, on the 1st day of the month, you shall have a Sabbath rest, a memorial of blowing of trumpets, a holy convocation. It's a Yom Teruah. It's a day of trumpeting. And, you could say of shouting, of, making noise. You shall do no customary work on it. You shall offer an offering made by fire to the Lord. Well, of course, there were offerings every day. So obviously on a holy day, you're going to have special offerings. Offerings can't be offered now. The temple is not functioning. But it's not essential in the New Testament to have them. The Jews, of course, in a way, Orthodox Jews are traumatized still because they can't, perform those offerings. And so they constantly are praying for a reestablishment of that system. And time will tell if there's any kind of effort to do that before the coming of Christ. We'll see how those prophecies work out. Anyway, and the Eternal spoke to Moses. Let's talk about this day coming up. It's very close to the time I'm speaking. The day of trumpeting, Yom Teruah, and it's normally called in the Hebrew-speaking world, Rosh Hashanah, the head of the year, the new year, because there are 2 years. A lot of you, if you deal with the government or you deal with certain businesses, you have a fiscal year. There's a year that everybody uses to keep time in the world today, January through December, but there's a fiscal year that often, I believe the government begins in October, their fiscal year. Well, in the Bible, we have the ecclesiastical year beginning in the spring, and we have the civil year beginning in the autumn. For example, if you go to Leviticus 25, you see that the Jubilee is declared on the Day of Atonement. So we have the civil year, and so the 7th month of the ecclesiastical year is the beginning of the civil year. So the year goes spring to spring as far as the church holidays are concerned, and it goes autumn to autumn as far as counting years. So, in other words, the next count would be on the first day of the 7th month, the next year. I want to talk about that Festival of Trumpets and its significance. This is the civil year, and this is how we count years, back and back and back. So evidently, we go back to the creation of the world for human habitation, what you might call the recreation of the world for Adam and Eve and their descendants. Eve is the mother of all humans, and so we have that taking place, that recreation of the world for the inhabitants of human beings, as we understand the term. That happens on the Festival of Trumpets. You could debate if it's the beginning of the week of creation or if it's the time of the creation of human beings, but it is that time of year when the creation begins. And so the blowing of the trumpet, trumpets were blown when a king was coronated. And so God is when He creates this world and puts human beings on it, He is then revealed as the one who made it and the one who has the right to rule over it, to be king. And so we have the blowing of the trumpeting as a part of that. And so in effect, this day of trumpeting looks back on the creation. Just as the Sabbath, each week we remember the creation. That is one of the, if you look at the 10 Commandments in Exodus 20, it speaks of the fact of God as creator, and so we have the Sabbath. And then in Deuteronomy, it talks about the Sabbath as picturing liberation from bondage. So in any case, the Sabbath from week to week reminds us of the creation God as creator, and the first day of the seventh month. Just as the seventh day reminds us of God as creator, the first day of the seventh month reminds us of God as creator. But there's more to it than that. As we enter this autumn festival season, it's the first of the festivals, and it's the time of trumpeting. It's like reveille. Wake up. It's a spiritual wake-up call. So theologically, it's an alarm, and it causes us to, get back in shape spiritually, to revive the spiritual side of our lives. That trumpet is an alarm. And yes, it does point to, prophetically, the day of the Lord, the time of judgment. But I want to go to the book of Joel, and of course those two concepts tie in together. But I want to go to Joel, the second chapter. Blow the trumpet in Zion, and sound an alarm in my holy mountain. Let all the inhabitants of the land tremble, for the day of the Lord is coming, for it is at hand. Yes, it's prophetically looks forward to the day of the Lord, and I'll say more about that in a moment. But each year, as we keep this festival, it ought to be a spiritual wake-up call. Get in shape spiritually. There are other festivals coming along. The Day of Atonement is coming along. The Festival of Tabernacles and the Eighth Day Sacred Assembly are coming along. This is the first of the festival days to get us in shape spiritually for all the rest of them. And it is the beginning of the civil year, so it's a time to, reinvigorate our commitment to God's way of life. And as I said, prophetically, it does look forward to the day of the Lord. We have the principle in the Bible of a day for a year. So this day of trumpeting is picturing a year, and that is the final year of a 3.5-year tribulation period. We have 2.5 years, and then God intervenes for that final year. And sometime in that final year, as we get into it, after several months have gone by, sometime in that final year will come the seventh trumpet. The trumpets are symbolic of God's judgments on the world. You can read about that in the book of Revelation. And then finally, we have the seventh trumpet, picturing the second coming of Christ. It will occur during that during that year, the day of the Lord. We don't know when Jesus Christ is going to return. You don't know, and I don't know. But I do believe we can say this much, that it would be in that final year as human civilization is being judged. And finally, God directly intervenes to establish his kingdom after the seventh trump has sounded. And Revelation 11 and verse 15. Then the seventh angel sounded, and there were loud voices in heaven saying, "The kingdoms of this world have become the kingdoms of our Lord and of his Christ, and he shall reign forever and ever." So that's the first of the appointed times of the autumn, and that is coming up as I speak very soon. Now I would like to remind you that we will be keeping those festivals here, God willing, here in Central Florida. So let us know if you'll be in the area, and particularly when we come to the 8 days, as the festival season reaches its climax. When we come to the 8 days, we are going to be staying in a hotel. We have a discount there. We have, of course, a place to meet there, and so on. And so if you're going to be in the area, let us know, and we can give you further details if you'd like to join us for those 8 days or a part of them. I want to go now to the 10th day of the 7th month, and I'll go back to Leviticus 23. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Also the 10th day of this 7th month shall be the day of atonement. It shall be a holy convocation to you. You shall afflict your souls and offer an offering made by fire to the Eternal." If you look at Psalm 35, verse 13 in the original Hebrew, if you read Isaiah 58, you'll see the affliction of your souls involves fasting. And again, it's a day of rest. "And you shall do no work on that same day, for it is the day of atonement, Yom HaKippurim." And normally in rabbinical Hebrew it's just called Yom Kippur. Yom HaKippurim. And you shall do no work on that same day, for it is a day of atonement, to make atonement for you before the Lord your God. Now, there really isn't, that I know of, and if you want to, give me some input on this, there isn't a particular historical event that I know of that exactly corresponds to this day. Once it's established, yes. We've had significant events such as, for example, in my lifetime and the lifetime of many of you, we've had the Yom Kippur War. That was a major event in the world back in 1973. There's been major events, but as God gave the day here, but I think that when people kept this day, they thought of, if it didn't happen at that exact time, but they thought of a historical event, and that is the expulsion of Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden. Which really began this whole mess that we've had since. And I think that at least as people kept the day, they probably remembered that the Satan in the form of a serpent deceived our father and mother. First our mother, and then she got our father to go along with it. And deceived our parents in that sense. Well, actually, Eve was deceived, and Adam was convinced by Eve to go along with it. So, in any case, they both sinned, and the result is what we see around us. There's good and there's evil in the world, unfortunately, and there's too much evil in the world, unfortunately. And I think that the Day of Atonement reminds us of that event, even if it didn't necessarily happen on that particular day. Now, theologically, the Day of Atonement is a time for us to really evaluate ourselves, because we're fasting. We have more time for study, for prayer. We're in a more sober frame of mind in a sense. Fasting isn't fun, so you're in a more sober frame of mind. Now it isn't a sad day, it's a joyful day because it's important to renew our relationship with God. It's a positive thing. And it also points to a very wonderful event prophetically, which I'll cover after a while. But in the tradition, in the history of the church, which was the Jewish community, when Jesus Christ came to the earth in his human ministry, he came to the church, and the church in his day, was the Jewish community, and the leadership were the scribes and Pharisees. And of course, he criticized them from within, not from without. He was called a rabbi. He was criticizing the Jewish community from within it. But at that time, of course, there was tremendous awe and solemnity associated with the Day of Atonement. The rituals in Leviticus 16 were carried out, and it was a very serious matter. And the tradition is that if a high priest was unqualified, and when he went into the Holy of Holies, if that high priest was unqualified, he wouldn't come out alive. The tradition is they would tie a rope around him, around his waist, I guess, and if he died, they drag him out. So once he came out alive, well, then there was joy that broke out. And you might surprise some of you, but the historical tradition is that once the high priest came out alive and people felt like, okay, we're back on track for this year, then the eligible maidens would dance, and the men would have the opportunity to see who the eligible women were at that time. Very interesting. Well, that's tradition. But the point I want to bring out is that this is a time when we fast to humble ourselves. It is a humbling experience, and we need to humble ourselves. We need to have a proper perspective when we come before God, and that helps us to achieve that, especially before a time when we're going to be doing a lot of feasting. We're going to have we spend more money than we normally are able to spend, when we come to the 8 days. So this prepares us for that by first fasting before we do the feasting, you could say. And it is humbling to fast, and that's part of what it is. The significance of it theologically. We need to get into a humble frame of mind. I want to go to Matthew the 5th chapter. Jesus tells us in in verse 3 of Matthew 5, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. If you don't look at yourself as so great, you're not narcissistic. If you're willing to consider other people and realize that you need other people. If you're going to really survive in this world, you're not going to do it on your own. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And then I want to jump to verse 5. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. So if you have an appropriate attitude, if you're not just overly boastful and proud and self-absorbed, if you have what the Bible talks about love in terms of, as I learned it as a young man, outgoing, unselfish, outgoing concern. If that's the way you are, if you're a person who has unselfish, outgoing concern, then you have a future. You have a future, and fasting in the Day of Atonement will help us to get in a proper frame of mind. And in Matthew 9, Jesus was asked, because when he was on earth, his disciples, had God in the flesh with them. And so, you can't, that's such an amazing experience. So you don't really need to fast at that time, beyond, of course, the commanded Day of Atonement. And may have kept also the fast that the Jews kept in memorializing the destruction of the temple and of Jerusalem in the 6th century BC. But they weren't doing any extra fasting. And in Matthew 9:14, then the disciples of John came to him, to Jesus, saying, why do we and the Pharisees fast often, but your disciples do not fast? And Jesus said to them, can the friends of the bridegroom mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them? But the days are coming when the bridegroom will be taken away from them, and then they will fast. So we don't have the bridegroom with us, so we're going to fast. So the least that we all ought to do is fast when we're commanded to do it, which is on the Day of Atonement. And even in Acts 27, we see in verse 9 a reference made to that fast. In the autumn of the year, the weather gets rainy, it gets stormy. The Feast of Tabernacles is right before, and the 8th day is right before the rainy season begins. During that time of year, Jews in the Middle East pray for rain, and all around the world, Jews pray for rain in that land. And they've done that ever since they've been exiled from the land. You go to a synagogue, on the 8th day of Sacred Assembly, and there'll be a prayer for rain. I want to go to verse 9 of Acts 27. Now, when much time had been spent and sailing was now dangerous because the fast was already over, Paul advised them. Now, prophetically, there's so much involved with the Day of Atonement. The rituals of the Day of Atonement are found in Leviticus 16, and they point to an awesome time in history. And you can understand why we would fast thinking about that, because it's just an awesome event. The putting away of the evil forces that we all have to battle, that pull us down. What we call human nature is not entirely that. It's partly, to a great degree actually, a downward influence that God has allowed. It's in this world. There are demonic forces that pull one down. And the Day of Atonement points to a time when they will be removed. And so, the battle with oneself will be so much easier then. There still might be a tendency to be a bit lazy or a bit selfish, but we won't have, when God created human beings, he said it's very good. Remember? And would he say that now about human beings? I mean, potentially, yes. And certainly many of us, I'm not including myself, but there are many people who are really great examples of heroism and dedication and all the rest of it, although even they may have certain flaws in other ways. But anyway, when the original creation was very good, but then we had, unfortunately, what people call the fall, and there was a fall. Now Satan fell. We can read about that, but then Satan caused human beings to rebel against their creator. Adam and Eve. My mother is no longer with us, but she used to tell a story because most people, the tradition is that it was an apple. No, but that's the tradition. That's why we call this, in English, we call this part of our body, we men, Adam's apple, right? But anyway, my mother used to tell the story. The problem wasn't the apple in the tree, but with the pear on the ground. The point I'm bringing out is that influence will be gone in the millennium, and what a event to think about prophetically, and Revelation 20 talks about it, and the rituals in Leviticus 16 point to it. So I want to go to Revelation 20. Then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, having the key to the bottomless pit and a great chain in his hand. He laid hold of the dragon, that serpent of old, who is the devil and Satan. John does this. He uses Greek and Hebrew in his writing. So you have Diablos, the slanderer, and Satan, the Hebrew, the accuser, or the opponent, right? The adversary, Satan, the adversary. So he laid hold of the dragon, that serpent of old, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years, and cast him into the bottomless pit, and shut him up, and set a seal on him, so that he should deceive the nations no more till the 1,000 years were finished. But after these things he must be released for a little while, and then that's the end of him forever, as far as having any power at all over anything or anyone. So obviously this is such an event. It is just an awesome event, and so we look forward to it as we fast on the Day of Atonement. And as I said, we also think of it as a time for us to get into a proper relationship with God. We had the wake-up call on the Festival of Trumpets. We had a 10-day period, to get back in shape. And then the Day of Atonement is in effect the spiritual climax of that period, where we conclude those 10 days with a fast. And then afterwards we're ready for the feasting, because we're now in a proper frame of mind. So if we go back, I see that I'm only going to have time for the first two of these four. So if we go back over what I've said, the Festival of Trumpets points to the creation of the world, and of human civilization. It's a spiritual wake-up call, and it looks forward to the day of the Lord, the day of judgment of this world that God created initially, and of human civilization, which He allowed to develop at that time from the beginning. And finally, it climaxes in the second coming of Christ. Now, one of our viewers suggested to me, the Jews have a tradition that at the end of the Day of Atonement, when the fast is ended, they say next year in Jerusalem, right? L'Shana Haba Yerushalayim, and then they blow the shofar one last time on the Day of Atonement. And he said, is that in a way? Should that in effect remind us of that seventh trumpet? And at first I thought, I kind of thought no, and then I said, you have a point there. Could very well be. There are elements of Jewish liturgy that remind us Christians of some very important principles. The Jews have preserved certain truths in their liturgy, and that could very well be the case. The Day of Atonement is the next day that I've spoken about, and the Day of Atonement reminds us, that unfortunately, we have sinned, we have come short, and we need to always get back into a right relationship with our Creator, and fasting helps us to do that. It reminds us of the expulsion, whether or not it happened on that day, reminds us of the expulsion of our parents from the Garden of Eden. It reminds us of our need to be in a proper frame of mind, particularly so that we can get the most out of the 8 days yet to come. And then it also points forward, to the putting away of Satan and his demons, to their total loss of power that will ultimately occur. The 1,000 years of the millennium, and then after that little while, forever after that. I'd like to go to Matthew 9, since I'm not going to talk about the other 2 days, and I'm just talking about these first 2 that are coming up. Let's go to Matthew 9 that I began to read from earlier, that passage about fasting, and notice what he says right afterwards, because what he was saying is he was bringing a new way of life. Yes, he inspired the Bible, the 10 Commandments and the various laws that we read of, but he was bringing a new perspective on it, and he was in effect giving the Spirit the spiritual intent of the written code. In the Sermon on the Mount, he was fulfilling a prophecy in Isaiah 42 and verse 21, which I'll go to. In that Sermon on the Mount, some of the scriptures I read from earlier, he was fulfilling Isaiah 42 and verse 21. The Eternal is well pleased for his righteousness' sake. He will exalt the law and make it honorable. And so in the Sermon on the Mount, he was fulfilling that statement, that prophecy. So he was bringing a new covenant. And so he says in the 14th verse, or actually I read the 14th and 15th verse. I want to go to the 16th verse now of Matthew 9. After he talked about fasting, he says this: "No one puts a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old garment, for the patch pulls away from the garment and the tear is made worse. Nor do they put new wine into old wineskins, or else the wineskins break, the wine is spilled, and the wineskins are ruined. But they put new wine into new wineskins, and both are preserved." So, in other words, he says, we've got to be renewed. As he told Nicodemus, we have to be born again. We need to be renewed. And even if we have had that experience of conversion, we need to recommit ourselves regularly and be renewed. And Paul says that in Romans 12. And so these festival days are a part of that and are a great help in that. I want to go to Romans 12. The beginning of that chapter. "I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, wholly acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service." After all God did for us, and does for us, and will do for us, that's our reasonable service. And the second verse says, Romans 12:2, "And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and agreeable and perfect will of God." So we need to continually be renewed. And that's, of course, one of the purposes of having these appointed times. Now, with your indulgence, I'm going to go to 2 more passages. I want to go to Psalm 111 and verse 10. And it's not enough to read about these days and study about them. That's fine. I'm glad that people do that. But let's keep them. I think keeping them will give us even much greater insight, as we see from Psalm 111. It says, verse 10, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. A good understanding have all those who do them." What is the them? The commandments of God, obviously. That's why the translation in my Bible says that. "A good understanding of all those who do his commandments. His praise endures forever." So we'll have a good understanding if we do it. If we keep the Festival of Trumpets, if we keep the Day of Atonement and the other festivals. And I want to conclude now by going to Revelation 14. You thought I'd never finish, and I really haven't finished, because I want to talk about the rest of the autumn festivals, which I'll do, God willing, at another time. But today I've reviewed a bit about the ones that are coming immediately, the Festival of Trumpets coming soon, and then the Day of Atonement. I want to go to Revelation 14 and verse 12. "Here is the patience of the saints. Here are those who are the saints. Here are those who keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus. So we are disciples of Jesus Christ. We have, I hope and pray, a right relationship with God through Jesus Christ, and we do keep His commandments, including His appointed times. So today I've discussed at least 2 of the 4 appointed times coming up, appointed times of autumn, and they're really divinely appointed times of autumn. So we Kaplans, Linda and I, and the rest of the family and the congregation here in Lakeland, wish for all of you a wonderful festival season coming up. All the best to you and yours.